There is a food that medieval households stored for years without refrigeration. Wheels of cheese that sat in cellars aging, developing flavor, becoming more valuable with time. Cheese so stable that it traveled across Europe in summer heat without spoiling. That fed armies on campaign for months. That served as currency because it held value better than coins. For over 1,000 years, cheese was wealth. A properly made wheel could last 2, 3, even 5 years in a cool, dry place. It didn't mold, it didn't rot. It just slowly transformed into something richer and more complex than when it was made. Then in the late 1800s, everything changed. Pasteurization laws required killing all bacteria in milk. Refrigeration became standard, and cheese transformed from a living food that aged gracefully into a dead product that spoils the moment you stop refrigerating it. The cheese in your refrigerator has an expiration date measured in weeks. Leave it out and it molds in days. That's not normal. That's not how cheese worked for thousands of years. That's the result of industrial dairy processing that prioritizes shelf appeal and distribution, efficiency over actual preservation. This is why medieval cheese lasted years, while yours rots in days, and why the dairy industry will never tell you what they destroyed. Welcome to Olden Path. If you've ever wondered why cheese from the store goes bad so fast while your ancestors stored it for years, hit subscribe and the bell. This explains everything. The first difference is the milk itself. Medieval cheese was made from raw milk, milk straight from the cow, sheep or goat. That milk contained living bacteria, beneficial organisms that had evolved with dairy animals for millennia, lactobacillus, lactococcus, and dozens of other species that protect milk from harmful bacteria by outcompeting them. When you make cheese from raw milk, those beneficial bacteria remain in the cheese. They continue working during aging. They produce compounds that inhibit mold and harmful bacteria. They create the complex flavors that define great cheese, and they make the cheese hostile to pathogens. Raw milk cheese is a living ecosystem. The beneficial bacteria are the immune system that keeps it safe. Modern cheese is made from pasteurized milk, milk that's been heated to kill all bacteria, beneficial and harmful alike. The logic is safety. Raw milk could contain pathogens. Pasteurization kills them, but it also kills everything else. The beneficial bacteria that protected the milk are dead. The enzymes that would have continued working during aging are denatured. What remains is sterile liquid that has no natural defenses. When you make cheese from pasteurized milk, you're starting with a blank slate. No beneficial bacteria, no natural protection. Modern cheesemakers add back specific bacterial cultures, starter cultures purchased from laboratories. These cultures are selected for predictable behavior and fast acid production. They make the milk coagulate reliably so the cheese sets properly, but they're a tiny fraction of the bacterial diversity that existed in raw milk. You've gone from hundreds of species to maybe 3 or 4. That lack of diversity means the cheese has no resilience, no backup systems. If one thing goes wrong, the cheese spoils. Medieval cheesemakers didn't add cultures. They didn't need to. The milk already contained everything necessary. The bacteria naturally present in raw milk from healthy animals are the right bacteria for cheesemaking. They've been selected over thousands of years of evolution to thrive in milk. They outcompete harmful bacteria because they're adapted to the environment. When you make raw milk cheese, you're working with an established ecosystem. Modern pasteurized cheese is an artificial construct that depends on refrigeration to stay safe because it has no natural defenses. The second difference is moisture content. Medieval cheese was aged until it was hard and dry. The longer cheese ages, the more moisture evaporates. Lower moisture means less water available for bacteria and mold to grow. Hard-aged cheese can drop to 30% moisture or less. At that level, very little can survive. The cheese becomes shelf-stable through dehydration. Parmesan, cheddar, and other traditional hard cheeses were aged for months or years, specifically to reduce moisture. The result was cheese that could sit on a shelf indefinitely without spoiling. When medieval households made cheese, they didn't eat it fresh. They waxed it, stored it in a cool cellar, and let it age. The cheese got harder, drier, and more flavorful. After a year, it was significantly more stable than when it was made. After 2 years, it was nearly imperishable. Modern cheese is sold with much higher moisture content. Soft cheeses like brie or camembert are 60 to 70% moisture. Even harder cheeses are often sold younger and moister than traditional versions because moisture means weight. Cheese is sold by weight. Higher moisture means more weight per wheel, which means more revenue. A wheel of cheese aged 2 years has lost significant moisture through evaporation. It weighs less than when it was made. From a business perspective, that's lost profit. So modern cheese is sold younger and moister. It tastes milder, which appeals to modern palates, but it spoils faster because the moisture supports bacterial and mold growth. The cheese in your refrigerator probably has 50 to 60% moisture. That's wet enough that mold spores landing on the surface can germinate and grow. Leave it out for a few days and you'll see fuzzy growth. That never happened with properly aged medieval cheese because the moisture content was too low. The third difference is salt. Medieval medieval cheese was heavily salted. Salt serves multiple functions in cheesemaking. It draws out additional moisture through osmosis. It inhibits bacterial growth by creating an inhospitable environment, and it contributes to flavor development during aging. Traditional cheese was either dry salted, where coarse salt was rubbed into the surface, or brine salted, where the cheese was submerged in saturated salt water for days or weeks. Either method resulted in high salt content, particularly near the surface. That salt created a barrier. Mold and bacteria struggled to establish on salty surfaces. The cheese could sit in a cellar for months and nothing would grow on it because the salt prevented colonization. Modern cheese uses less salt. Again, this is partly about appealing to modern tastes. People have been taught that salt is dangerous. Low salt products are marketed as healthier, but reduced salt means reduced preservation. The cheese is more vulnerable to surface mold. It needs to be wrapped in plastic and refrigerated to stay safe. Even then, it doesn't last long. Open a package of modern cheese and you have maybe a week before mold appears. That's because the salt content isn't high enough to prevent growth, and the cheese doesn't have the beneficial bacteria to outcompete mold. Medieval cheese had both high salt plus living, beneficial bacteria. The combination made it nearly impossible for anything harmful to establish. The fourth difference is the rind. Medieval cheese developed natural rinds during aging. As the cheese sat in the cellar, beneficial molds and bacteria colonized the surface. These weren't harmful organisms, they were protective. Certain molds, particularly Penicillium species, form white or gray blooms on aging cheese. These molds are the same genus that produces penicillin. They're antimicrobial. They prevent harmful bacteria from colonizing the cheese surface. Traditional cheesemakers encouraged these molds. They aged cheese in caves or cellars where the right molds were present in the air. The molds would naturally colonize the cheese, forming a protective rind. That rind was edible, it contributed to flavor, and it kept the cheese safe during long aging. Modern cheese often has artificial rinds, wax coatings, or plastic wrapping that seal the cheese from air. These work for preservation, but they don't allow the cheese to breathe. Natural rinds are permeable. They allow moisture to escape slowly while protecting the interior. Wax and plastic trap moisture inside. The cheese can't continue developing during storage. It just sits static until you eat it or it spoils. Some modern artisan cheesemakers still use natural rind aging, but commercial cheese is almost always waxed or wrapped because it's more consistent and easier to handle during distribution. The trade-off is that the cheese doesn't develop the same complexity or stability that natural rind aging provides. The fifth difference is aging environment. Medieval cheese was aged in cool, stable environments, stone cellars, caves, or dedicated cheese storage rooms. These spaces maintained temperatures between 50 and 60 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, cool enough to slow bacterial growth, warm enough that beneficial aging processes continued. The humidity was controlled naturally. Stone walls absorbed excess moisture. Air circulation prevented mold buildup. The cheese aged slowly and evenly. Different cheeses were aged for different lengths of time depending on type and intended use. Soft, fresh cheeses were consumed within weeks. Hard cheeses were aged for months to years. The aging environment was critical. Too warm and the cheese would spoil. Too cold and aging stopped. Too humid and surface mold grew uncontrolled. Too dry and the cheese dried out too quickly, cracking and losing moisture too fast. Medieval cheesemakers understood their cellars. They knew which areas were cooler or warmer, which spots had better air circulation, where to place cheese for fast aging versus slow aging. This was empirical knowledge built through generations of experience. Modern cheese is aged in temperature, controlled facilities, or not aged significantly at all. Commercial operations use refrigerated aging rooms, where temperature and humidity are precisely controlled. This produces consistent results, but it also requires energy. Refrigeration units running constantly. The cheese depends on that refrigeration. Turn off the power and the cheese warms up. Aging accelerates uncontrollably, or the cheese begins to spoil. Medieval cheese cellars required no energy input. They worked through thermal mass and natural air circulation. The cheese aged safely regardless of whether anyone tended it. The sixth difference is packaging. Medieval cheese was protected with natural materials, wax, cloth, or simply left with a natural rind. Beeswax was melted and painted onto cheese wheels to seal them. The wax was permeable enough to allow some gas exchange, but impermeable to moisture and contaminants. Cheese wheels sealed in wax could be stacked, transported, and stored for years. The wax protected the cheese physically and created a barrier against pests and mold. Cloth wrapping worked similarly. Cheesecloth soaked in lard or butter was wrapped around wheels. The fat created a protective seal. Some cheeses were simply left with their natural rind and stored carefully to prevent damage. Modern cheese is wrapped in plastic. Plastic is convenient, it's cheap, it seals completely, and it's transparent so you can see the product. But plastic is impermeable. No gas exchange, no moisture escape. The cheese suffocates. Any moisture that would have evaporated during aging is trapped inside the plastic. That moisture condenses on the surface, and that condensation is the perfect environment for mold growth. This is why modern cheese molds so quickly once you open the package. The moisture trapped by plastic has created ideal conditions for mold. Reseal it, and the problem continues. The only solution is refrigeration cold enough to slow mold growth, but that refrigeration also stops any beneficial aging processes. The cheese doesn't improve. It just sits until it spoils. Here's what most people don't understand about cheese aging. Aging isn't just storage, it's transformation. Enzymes in the cheese break down proteins and fats into smaller molecules. Those molecules create flavor compounds, sharp, tangy, nutty, complex flavors that don't exist in fresh cheese. The longer cheese ages, the more transformation occurs. A wheel of cheddar at 3 months tastes mild. At 1 year, it's sharper. At 2 years, it's complex and intense. That transformation happens because the cheese is alive. Enzymes are still active. Beneficial bacteria are still working. Medieval cheese was alive during aging. It improved with time. Modern cheese is mostly dead. Pasteurization killed the enzymes. The cheese can't transform the same way. It can develop some flavor through the starter cultures that were added back, but it's a shadow of what real aging produces. This is why traditional European cheeses are still made the old way in some regions. Parmigiano Reggiano, aged for 2 years minimum and sometimes 5 or more. Comté, aged for 18 to 24 months. These cheeses are still made from raw milk in some cases or from carefully selected pasteurized milk with complex culture additions. They're aged in traditional cellars. They develop natural rinds, and they last for years because they're made properly. But these are expensive specialty cheeses. The average person buys commodity cheese made from pasteurized milk, aged minimally, wrapped in plastic and sold at a price point that requires cutting every corner possible. That cheese cannot last. It's designed to be sold quickly and consumed quickly. Extended shelf life would slow sales velocity. The dairy industry needs you buying cheese frequently. Here's the conspiracy. Pasteurization laws were promoted as public health measures. Raw milk could contain tuberculosis or brucellosis. Pasteurization eliminated those risks. That justification was legitimate in the early 1900s when dairy sanitation was poor and animal diseases were common, but the implementation went beyond safety. Laws didn't just require pasteurization for commercial sales. They prohibited or severely restricted raw milk sales, even for people who wanted to accept the risk. In many states and countries, you cannot legally buy raw milk even directly from a farmer. The justification is that raw milk is inherently dangerous, but millions of people worldwide consume raw milk and raw milk cheese without issues. The real issue is control. Industrial dairy operations cannot produce safe raw milk. Their scale is too large. Cows are too concentrated. Disease pressure is too high. Pasteurization is necessary because the milk is produced in conditions where contamination is likely. Small-scale dairies with healthy animals can produce safe raw milk, but allowing raw milk sales would create competition for industrial dairy. Small farmers could sell premium raw milk cheese at high prices. Consumers might prefer it. The industrial system would lose market share, so raw milk stays illegal or restricted. The laws protect industrial dairy from competition while claiming to protect public health. Those same laws make it impossible to produce cheese the medieval way. You can't make traditional long-aged raw milk cheese. If raw milk is illegal, you're forced to use pasteurized milk. You're forced to add commercial cultures. You're forced into methods that produce cheese that doesn't last, and that creates dependence. You can't make your own long-lasting cheese even if you have access to milk. You're dependent on buying cheese from stores. That dependence is profitable. Frequent purchases, consistent sales, no one storing cheese for years, everyone buying regularly. That's the business model. Some traditional cheesemakers have fought back. In Europe, raw milk cheese aged over 60 days is legal in many countries because the aging process is considered sufficient to kill pathogens. In the United States, the same 60-day rule exists, but enforcement varies. Some states allow raw milk sales, others prohibit it entirely. The patchwork of regulations makes it difficult for small producers to operate. Large industrial dairy operations have no problem complying. They already use pasteurized milk. Small farmers trying to make traditional cheese face regulatory barriers that large operations don't. The result is consolidation. Small cheesemakers disappear. Industrial producers dominate, and traditional methods are lost. What the dairy industry won't admit is that properly made raw milk cheese is safer than many modern foods. Studies of traditional cheesemaking show that the combination of salt, low moisture, low pH from lactic acid, and beneficial bacteria creates an environment where pathogens can't survive. Tests of traditional raw milk cheese, aged for months, show no harmful bacteria. The cheese is microbiologically safe, but it's also economically threatening. A wheel of cheese that lasts 2 years without refrigeration undermines the entire cold chain infrastructure that modern dairy depends on. Refrigerated trucks, refrigerated warehouses, refrigerated display cases. All of that becomes unnecessary if cheese doesn't need refrigeration. The infrastructure investment becomes worthless, so traditional cheese-making methods had to be suppressed. Modern cheese science is starting to acknowledge what traditional cheesemakers always knew. Recent research shows that raw milk cheese contains beneficial bacteria that improve gut health. Studies demonstrate that traditional aging methods create compounds with antimicrobial properties. Scientists have confirmed that properly aged hard cheese is shelf-stable without refrigeration. All of this validates what medieval cheesemakers did, but it's too late. The knowledge has been lost in most places. The infrastructure for traditional cheesemaking barely exists, and regulations make it difficult to practice, even if you wanted to. Some people are trying to revive traditional methods. Artisan cheesemakers producing small batches of raw milk cheese, aged properly. Homesteaders making cheese from their own animals. These efforts are valuable, but they're niche. Most people will never taste real traditionally made cheese. They'll eat industrial cheese that spoils quickly and wonder why their ancestors could store cheese for years. The answer is that their ancestors made real cheese, living food with natural defenses and proper aging. What you buy in stores is a simulation of cheese. It looks similar, it melts similarly, but it doesn't last because it was never designed to last. You can see the difference in quality. Traditional aged cheese has complex crystalline texture, tiny crunchy crystals of concentrated amino acids that form during long aging. The flavor is intense and layered, sharp, nutty, slightly sweet, with lingering finish. Modern cheese is smooth and mild, pleasant enough, but one-dimensional. It doesn't have the depth that comes from years of enzymatic transformation, and it doesn't have the stability. Break open a wheel of 5-year aged Parmigiano Reggiano, and the inside is dry, crumbly, intensely flavored. That wheel could sit on your counter for weeks without molding because the moisture content is so low and the salt content is so high. Break open a package of supermarket Parmesan and it's moist, soft, mild. It molds within days if not refrigerated. These are not the same food. They're called by the same name, but they're fundamentally different. The loss of traditional cheesemaking is a loss of food security. Medieval households that made cheese properly could store protein and fat for years without any energy input. A successful cheesemaking season produced enough wheels to feed the family through winter and into the next year. That cheese was insurance against crop failure. It was wealth that could be traded or sold. It was food security that didn't depend on anyone else. Modern cheese dependence is the opposite. You must buy it regularly. You must refrigerate it constantly. You must consume it quickly. You have no long-term food security from cheese because your cheese doesn't last. That dependence was created intentionally through regulations that made traditional methods illegal or impractical. If this explained why your cheese molds in days while medieval cheese lasted years, subscribe to Olden Path and hit the bell. Share this with people who want to understand what real food preservation looked like. Comment and tell me if you've ever tasted traditionally aged raw milk cheese. This isn't just about cheese. It's about understanding that modern food is designed for corporate profit, not preservation or nutrition. Medieval cheese lasted years because it was made properly. Yours rots in days because every step of modern production prioritizes shelf appeal and sales velocity over actual quality.